Welcome back. Picture a morning in early June. The air already thick with heat, gulls circling low over a harbor crowded with tall ships, and the streets of a small peninsula town packed shoulder to shoulder with sailors, merchants, and enslaved laborers going about the business of the richest port in the New World. It is a Tuesday. The taverns from the night before still smell of rum and tallow smoke. A reverend is settling in for a glass of wine with the acting governor. Nobody in this town has any reason to believe that within minutes, the ground beneath their feet will turn to liquid and swallow 2 out of every 3 buildings whole. Using AI-assisted reconstructions, restored historic paintings, and the findings of underwater archaeology, we are going to walk through this place as it once stood, street by street, before the sea took it. And by the end of this video, you will see exactly what remains of it today, still sitting beneath the waves and along the shoreline of modern Jamaica. Long before Port Royal earned its reputation as the wickedest city in the world, this narrow spit of sand jutting into Kingston Harbor was little more than a convenient strip of coastline. Taino fishing communities had known these waters for centuries, drawn by the natural deep water anchorage that curved protectively around the bay. When Spanish colonizers arrived in the early 16th century, they largely ignored this sandy cay, favoring settlements further inland where fresh water and fertile soil made permanent life easier. It was the English, after seizing Jamaica from Spain in 1655, who recognized what the Spanish had overlooked. The harbor here was one of the finest natural anchorages in the Caribbean, deep enough that a warship could tie up almost against the shore. Within a few short years, a rough collection of wooden storehouses, taverns, and fortified batteries rose on the sand. Nobody living in those first crowded years, hammering together clapboard houses on a spit of loose sediment, imagined they were founding what would soon become one of the wealthiest trading cities on earth. They were simply building a place to sell what privateers brought in, and to spend what those same privateers earned. By the 1680s, Port Royal had exploded into something almost unrecognizable from its origins. Roughly 2,000 structures were now packed into just 51 acres of land, a density that rivaled the most crowded quarters of London. Multi-story brick townhouses lined narrow streets, their upper floors overhanging the ground level to catch what little breeze moved through the alleys. Warehouses along the waterfront groaned under the weight of sugar, indigo, and captured Spanish silver. The wealth flowing through the port was staggering for a town its size, fed largely by privateering profits and the trade in enslaved people, and merchants competed to outdo one another with imported furniture, fine glassware, and tailored coats shipped in from England. Construction never really stopped. New foundations were constantly being poured to replace buildings damaged by the smaller tremors that had rattled the town before, in 1667 and again in 1688, each time toppling a handful of houses and each time patched over and forgotten as life resumed. This was not a finished, polished city. It was a raw, still-growing boomtown, its bricklayers and carpenters perpetually a few steps behind the money pouring in, its foundations resting, unknown to nearly everyone, on nothing more solid than compacted sand and coral rubble. At the civic and spiritual center of this crowded peninsula stood St. Paul's Church, its bell calling merchants and sailors alike to services that blended Anglican formality with the rough manners of a frontier port. Nearby, a customs house and a courthouse handled the endless paperwork of trade, taxation, and the licensing of privateers who operated in a legal gray zone between piracy and sanctioned warfare. Religious life here was far from uniform. Jewish merchants, many of them refugees from Spanish and Portuguese persecution elsewhere in the Caribbean, ran some of the town's most successful trading houses and maintained their own community and burial grounds. Nonconformist Protestants, Catholics quietly tolerated despite English law, and a growing population of enslaved Africans, whose spiritual practices were suppressed but never fully erased, all shared these few crowded acres. Governance was similarly layered. English colonial authority stacked awkwardly atop older Spanish administrative habits and the practical realities of a town that ran, in large part, on the informal power of whoever commanded the most cannon and the most credit. Step down into the streets themselves and the sheer human noise becomes almost overwhelming. An estimated 6,500 people called Port Royal home at its peak. Roughly 2,500 of them enslaved men and women whose forced labor built and ran nearly every warehouse, kitchen, and dock in the town. The remainder was an unusually cosmopolitan mix for the era, English, Welsh, Scottish, Dutch, Portuguese, and free people of African and mixed descent, all packed into streets barely wide enough for two carts to pass. The smell of the place would have hit you before anything else. Tar and brine from the harbor mixing with wood smoke, roasting meat, spilled rum, and the less pleasant odor of open gutters running between the houses. Taverns outnumbered nearly every other kind of business, and it was said only half in jest that this small town supported more drinking houses per resident than any city in the English world. Graffiti and carved initials marked doorframes and barrels alike, small human signatures left by sailors who might be gone to sea again within days. If any single building captured the town's appetite for spectacle, it was the waterfront itself, functioning as market, stage, and gathering ground all at once. Ships from a dozen nations tied up along its wharves, and it was here that captured cargo was auctioned. News from across the Atlantic first arrived, and the town's fortunes rose and fell with the tide of incoming vessels. Public punishments, celebrations of naval victories, and the arrival of especially notorious privateers all drew crowds to these docks, turning ordinary commerce into something closer to theater. It was common knowledge across the Caribbean that whatever happened on the high seas, word of it would reach Port Royal's waterfront first, and the town took evident pride in being the place where fortunes were made and lost within sight of the water that made them possible. A short distance away, along streets reserved for the town's wealthiest merchants and highest-ranking officials, stood the private residences of Port Royal's elite, brick townhouses filled with imported mahogany furniture, silver plate, and glassware shipped across an ocean at enormous expense. Some of these homes rose 3 stories, with private courtyards and even small gardens cultivated in imported soil, a considerable luxury on a sandy spit with no natural farmland of its own. These were the households of the merchant princes who financed privateering voyages and grew richer with every captured Spanish galleon. Yet for all their wealth and fine imported glass, these homes rested on precisely the same treacherous sand as the poorest sailor's shack near the docks, a fact that none of their owners had any reason to consider on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning in June. That morning came on the 7th of June, 1692. The day had begun unremarkably, with churchgoers gathering for a late morning service and merchants opening their shops as usual. At approximately 11:40 in the morning, the ground began to move, not with a single violent jolt but with a strange, rolling motion that witnesses later struggled to describe, as though the earth itself had become liquid. Within moments, a powerful earthquake, estimated by modern seismologists at a magnitude near 7.5, tore through the loosely packed sand beneath the town. The sediment, saturated with seawater and never anchored to solid bedrock, liquefied almost instantly. Streets that had stood firm for decades began to open and close in waves, and building foundations simply gave way beneath their own weight. Survivors later described watching entire rows of houses slide downward as though pulled by an invisible hand, their inhabitants vanishing with them. Within roughly 2 minutes of the first shock, close to 2/3 of the town, an area of some 33 acres, had slipped beneath the harbor. A tsunami followed almost immediately, driving a wall of water across what remained of the peninsula and lifting ships clean out of the harbor. One vessel was famously deposited on top of a half-collapsed building. In those first catastrophic minutes, most people had no way of understanding what was actually happening to them. Many likely believed, in the confusion and noise, that the world itself was ending, when in fact they were experiencing one of the most violent and fast-moving instances of soil liquefaction ever documented, an entirely physical, explainable process that nonetheless produced scenes indistinguishable from myth. By the time the shaking and flooding subsided, an estimated 2,000 people had drowned or been crushed outright, with several thousand more dying in the following weeks from injuries and the disease that swept through the survivors camped among the ruins. In the days and weeks that followed, chaos took hold of what remained. Looters moved through the wreckage of warehouses and homes even as rescue efforts continued, and the bodies of the recently dead mingled in the harbor with corpses washed loose from the town's flooded cemetery, a grim detail recorded by more than one horrified witness. Disease spread quickly through the crowded survivor camps, claiming lives that the earthquake itself had spared. Over the following decades, Port Royal was partially rebuilt, only to be struck again by a devastating fire in 1703 and a string of hurricanes in the early 18th century, each disaster stripping away a little more of what had once been the wealthiest port in the English Caribbean. Slowly, the town's commercial importance shifted across the harbor to the growing settlement of Kingston, and Port Royal faded into a modest fishing and naval outpost. Its golden age reduced to legend and the occasional grim story told by sailors about a sunken city visible in calm, clear water. It was not until the 20th century that serious archaeological attention returned to the submerged remains beneath the harbor. Underwater excavations beginning in the 1950s and continuing for decades afterward revealed something remarkable. An entire slice of late 17th century urban life preserved almost intact beneath layers of sediment, protected from the decay and rebuilding that erases most historic sites on land. Divers recovered furniture, ceramics, tools, and personal belongings frozen in the exact positions they had occupied the instant the ground gave way. Among the most haunting discoveries was a pocket watch. Its hands stopped at the precise moment the earthquake struck, a small mechanical witness to a single, specific instant of catastrophe. Archaeologists found kitchens with cookware still arranged for a meal that was never finished, and merchant houses with their imported glassware shattered exactly where it had stood on the shelf. What struck researchers most was not the scale of the destruction but its intimacy. An entire ordinary morning captured underwater, unaltered for nearly 3 centuries. It is worth pausing here to remember that beneath these waters lie not simply artifacts, but the unfinished lives of thousands of ordinary people, merchants counting the morning's accounts, cooks preparing a midday meal, children playing in alleyways between crowded houses. The ruins are not just a curiosity of geology and history. They are a town that was, for a few generations, as loud, alive, and human as any city has ever been. Today, if you travel to the tip of the Palisados Peninsula outside Kingston, you will find a quiet fishing village of a few thousand residents, a fraction of the crowded metropolis that once stood there. Fort Charles, the old battery that once anchored the town's defenses and later hosted a young Horatio Nelson, still stands above the waterline, one of the only major structures from 1692 to have survived both the earthquake and the centuries since. St. Peter's Church, built in the years after the disaster on the site of an earlier place of worship, still holds services today and displays relics recovered from the sunken town, including silverware said to have been used by pirates long before it was pulled from the harbor floor. The bustling waterfront where auctions and celebrations once drew entire crowds now lies quietly beneath a few meters of clear Caribbean water, close enough to shore that snorkelers occasionally glimpse the outline of old foundations in the sand. The grand merchant townhouses, their brick walls and courtyards, remain part of an active underwater archaeological site, still slowly giving up new details with every careful excavation season. A small museum near the fort now displays the pocket watch, ceramics, and personal items pulled from the ruins, offering visitors a direct, physical connection to that single Tuesday morning in 1692 when an entire thriving city slipped beneath the sea in under 2 minutes. Thank you so much for spending this time with me and walking through the streets of a city the ocean swallowed whole. If there's a lost place, a vanished empire, or a single dramatic turning point in history you'd like to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments below. I read every one of them and they genuinely shape what we cover next. If this journey through Port Royal moved you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next place we bring back from the past. And I'll see you again soon for another walk through history.